Last time we spoke about the Mandalay offensive. In the midst of intense warfare, General Kruger positioned his troops strategically to bolster the assault upon Rosario. As the American forces repelled counterattacks in advance, they faced fierce Japanese resistance, particularly at Binalonan and Hill 600. Despite heavy casualties, the Americans gradually gained ground, clearing areas and preparing for a future offensive. Meanwhile, Japanese defenses were fortified but weakened by shortages. As the battles raged on, both sides braced for a decisive confrontation in the ongoing struggle for control over Luzon. In the fierce battle across the hills of Luzon, the 103rd Regiment aimed to secure key positions but faced heavy resistance, capturing Hill 800 by nightfall. The 172nd Regiment achieved surprise at Hill 900, while other regiments advanced under relentless fire. Meanwhile, in Burma, the British Indian forces captured Chuebo, pushing deeper against Japanese defenses. The Mars Task Force disrupted supply lines, leading to a Japanese retreat, and amidst all of the chaos, both sides suffered heavy losses, marking a pivotal moment in the campaign. This episode is the return to Bataan. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on the Pacific War channel, I just released 2 podcasts covering Pacific War naval battles, and on Echoes of War, we just released a few Napoleonic-era battles. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And if you've been paying attention to my community posts, I am thinking about doing a multi-part series on an alternate history on how Japan could have possibly done better during World War II. If that's of interest to you, go over to my Patreon or my YouTube membership and vote on it. By the end of January, as previously noted on Luzon, the 43rd Division had secured most of Rosario's region and Route 3, from Pozo Rubio to the crucial junction with Route 11. The 25th Division had successfully eliminated the Shigemi detachment at San Manuel, while the 6th Division had cleared out the Cabaran Hills and established outposts between Balangao and Gumba. Meanwhile, the 14th Corps had advanced to Clark Field, where it engaged in a fierce battle with the Kembu Group. By January the 27th, the 40th Division had breached General Tsukada's northern defensive line, and the 37th Division had fortified Mabalacat, Angeles, and Runway No. 1 in preparation for the final push towards Manila. On that same day, General Kruger received significant reinforcements with the arrival of the 1st Cavalry Division, the 32nd Division, and the 112th Cavalry Regiment at Ligian Gulf. He planned to gather the Cavalry Division at Guimba to launch a coordinated advance towards the capital along the eastern side of the Central Plains via Route 5. After returning the reserve 35th Regiment to General Mullins, Kruger intended to deploy the 32nd Division, minus the 126th Regiment in the Army Reserve, to the San Manuel Asingan area. This would allow the 25th and the 6th Divisions to narrow their fronts and continue south and southeast towards the Kablupao line, with reduced risk of exposing the 1st Corps' flank. Additionally, this strategy would enable the 37th Division to resume its advance towards Manila. However, General Griswold wanted to push Tsukada's forces further into the Zambales Mountains first, directing General Beitler to assault the enemy's southern defensive line centered around Fort Stotzenburg, while only the 148th Regiment and the 37th Reconnaissance Troop moved south along Route 3 to San Fernando. On January the 28th, the attack commenced as planned, with the 129th Regiment advancing westwards through Runway No. 2, but it was quickly halted by formidable forward defenses at the Iguchi Detachment. Meanwhile, with the assistance of Filipino guerrillas, reconnaissance units from the 37th Division successfully secured the San Fernando bridges, all intact. To the north of the Bamban River, the 160th Regiment faced unexpectedly light resistance as it moved along the ridge line to capture the open crested hill 620, although it would later encounter strong opposition when it reached the main defenses of the Takea Detachment. At the same time, General Patrick began gathering the 1st and 20th Regiments at Gumba and Victoria, while the 6th Reconnaissance Troop advanced towards Cabanatuan, where they identified a significant Japanese concentration. Further north, the 35th Regiment advanced unopposed to the barrio of Gonzales, while the 27th Regiment moved overland and successfully dislodged a Japanese outpost from the barrio of Pimenta. Meanwhile, General MacArthur was planning a secondary landing on the Zambales coast of Luzon, assigning Major General Charles Hall's 11th Corps, which included the 38th Division and the 34th Regiment, to land at San Antonio and to quickly advance across the base of Bataan to prevent any significant Japanese retreat into the peninsula. He also aimed to divert the Kembu Group's attention to relieve some pressure on the 14th Corps. However, General Yamashita had no intention of retreating to Bataan, and he had only dispatched Colonel Nagiyoshi Sadanobu's 39th Regiment to defend the peninsula and the Kembu Group's right flank. On January the 26th, Hall's 11th Corps had departed Leyte Island aboard vessels from Admiral Struvel's Task Force 38.3, heading directly to Luzon for the senatorial landing, codenamed Operation Mike 7. The convoy reached its destination on the morning of January the 29th. After receiving reports from Filipino guerrillas indicating that there were no Japanese forces in the landing area, Struble decided to cancel the planned pre-assault bombardment. Instead, he ordered Hall's 4 regiments to land simultaneously across a nearly 6-mile stretch of coastline from San Antonio. Upon landing, the 151st Regiment secured San Felipe and San Antonio, while the 149th Regiment quickly moved inland to capture the San Marcelino airstrip. However, they discovered that guerrillas led by Captain Raymond Magasese had already taken control of the airstrip 3 days prior. Before nightfall, the 34th Regiment and the 24th Reconnaissance Troop advanced south along Route 7 to the northern shore of Subic Bay. To the east, the 160th Regiment made significant progress, advancing nearly 2 miles southwest and breaching a stronghold at the center of the Takaya detachment. The 129th Regiment also managed to penetrate enemy defenses into the Fort Stotzenburg area, but was halted at the barrio of Taekwondo by 6 tanks from the Yanagimoto detachment. Despite this setback, the inability of the Japanese counterattacks to reclaim any lost territory compelled Tsukada to order the Iguchi and the Yanagimoto detachments to retreat to their main line of resistance. Meanwhile, further north, units from the 1st and 20th Regiment successfully captured Licab and Talavera, cutting off the road between Cabanatuan and Manaus. The 27th Regiment engaged a small tank artillery force from the 2nd Tank Division that had become trapped along the highway between Gonzales and Pimenta. With the rapid advances of the 6th and 25th Divisions, the 2nd Tank Division's main strength in the Tayug Triangle area was in danger of being cut off from its sole remaining escape route into the northern bastion via San Jose and Highway No. 5. To meet the new situation, General Iwanaka was directed to pull back all the remaining divisional strength from the Tayug, Uminagan, and Triangle Hill sectors, with the exception of small outpost forces to be left in the Gonzales and Uminagan area to delay an enemy advance from the northwest. The division was instead to concentrate the bulk of its forces in the triangular-shaped area bounded by Lapao, Manaus, and Rizal. These new dispositions had barely been effected when enemy elements swept across the outpost forces at Gonzales and cut the withdrawal route to Umingan, forcing the detachment to withdraw through the hills after destroying most of its tanks and all of its mechanized artillery. From 8 p.m. on the 29th until 4:30 a.m. the next morning, the force tried unsuccessfully to breach through the Pimenta perimeter against a sharp enemy. By the time the action had ended, the 27th Regiment had killed 125 Japanese and destroyed 8 tanks, 8 artillery prime movers, 4 tractors, 805mm howitzers, and 5 trucks, while only losing about 15 men killed and 45 wounded. Only 4 tanks succeeded in breaching through the enemy encirclement and escaping along the highway to Umingan. The next day, the 27th Regiment began positioning itself to attack Umingan from the north and northwest, while the 35th Regiment started preparations for a holding attack from the west and southwest. In an effort to avert the mass execution of prisoners of war at Cabanatuan, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci led a contingent of approximately 233 men composed of Filipino guerrillas, soldiers from the Alamo Scouts, and Mucci's 6th Ranger Battalion. They traversed 30 miles cross-country between January the 28th and the 30th to liberate 522 weakened prisoners during the night. Most of the prisoners had vacated the camp by about 9:10. Rangers and guerrillas had to carry most piggybacking them or making hasty litters from rifles and shirts. It was 2 miles to the Pampanga River, where carts waited to take them to Platero to be treated, fed, and organized. Many were still in shock and had not yet fully understood what the hell was going on. At 8:40, Captain Price was at the Pamagon River supervising the loading of stumbling prisoners into 25 carts as rangers and prisoners trickled in. The rest of the scouts established an ambush at a crossing site. At 8:45, 1 hour after the raid was launched, Prince fired the third red flare and departed for Balancaire. The loaded caribou carts were ordered on their way to Balancaire at about 9:45. Meanwhile, Major Robert Lapin's guerrilla forces provided cover for their escape, successfully returning them to the Allied lines on January 31st. During this operation, around 270 Japanese soldiers were killed at the camp, with an additional 900 casualties along the Kabu River. Over 270 Japanese lay dead or dying in the smoldering camp. Most were wounded, dying by dawn, as there was no aid forthcoming. Japanese bodies were literally stacked at the Kabu Bridge, and scores more littered over the riverside woods. The 359th Battalion had ceased to exist. In the morning, the battalion commander, Captain Oyano, was still alive, but most of his officers were dead. Just 255 men of 1,200 survived, and most were wounded. In contrast, the Americans suffered only 2 fatalities and 7 wounded, along with 12 wounded Filipinos and 2 dead prisoners. Fortunately, the anticipated retaliation against the Filipino population did not occur, as the Japanese retreated from the area within a day of the raid, while the 20th Regiment secured the road junction barrio of Balak and began advancing towards Manaus. On January the 30th, Griswold continued his vigorous offensive against Clark Field. The 129th Regiment cleared the hills near Dolores and took control of the abandoned Fort Stolzenberg area, while the 160th Regiment made only 500 yards of progress against the determined Takaya detachment. The 108th Regiment finally captured Hill 5 and Thrall Hill, and further south, patrols from the 37th Division reached within a mile of Columpit and the Pampacan River, and on Bataan. The 34th Regiment took Olongapo after a fierce skirmish, while the 2nd Battalion of the 151st Regiment captured Grande Island at the entrance of Subic Bay. At the same time, MacArthur was strategizing another secondary landing on Luzon, this time utilizing General Swing's 11th Airborne Division to assault Nasugbu, located 45 miles southwest of Manila. Within this operation, MacArthur aimed to initiate a southern advance towards Manila, while simultaneously hindering Japanese forces in southern Luzon from moving north to challenge General Kruger's main offensive. General Eichelberger intended to deploy the 187th and 188th Glider Regiments and to advance them approximately 20 miles along Route 17 to Tagaytay Ridge. There, the 511th Parachute Regiment would conduct an airdrop to secure the ridge for the ground troops and to capture adjacent sections of Route 17, before the Japanese could regroup to defend the highway. In opposition, General Yokoyama had assigned only the Fuji Force to defend the area south of Manila. This force, centered around Colonel Fujishugi Masatoshi, reinforced 17th Regiment, had only deployed the 3rd Battalion of the 31st Regiment in the Tagaytay Ridge region, with a small outpost at Nasugbu and its main defensive positions on Mounts Karililao and Butalo. At this stage, Yokoyama was nearing completion of the organization of the diverse Shimbu Group forces east of Manila into a cohesive combat task force. To the north, near Ipoh, he had stationed the Kawashima Force, which was composed of the 82nd Brigade and the 31st Regiment. To the south, the main contingent of the former Manila Defense Force had been relocated from the Philippine capital and renamed the Kobayashi Force, guarding the Wawa Montalban area. However, the departure of General Tsudza's 105th Division to the northern stronghold had created a significant gap in the Shimbu Group's defenses. Although Yokoyama intended to address this vulnerability with the Noguchi Detachment, Major General Noguchi Susumo's troops were still in the midst of a lengthy march from the Bicol Peninsula by the end of January. As a temporary solution, the Okita Detachment, a composite force consisting of 5 battalions centered around the 186th Independent Battalion, the Kuromiya Detachment, a 3-battalion unit based on the 181st Independent Battalion, were deployed in the Boso-Boso and Topolo region. Meanwhile, the Kugari Detachment, organized around the 1st Surface Raiding Base Force, was stationed at Lemon Bay. Manila was entrusted to Rear Admiral Awabuchi Sanji's Manila Naval Defense Force, which included approximately 13,700 naval personnel from the 31st Special Base Force responsible for defending the islands of Manila Bay and the capital, along with some Army reinforcements. On January the 27th, Swing's 11th Airdrop Division departed from Leyte Island aboard ships from Admiral Fudge Teller's Task Group 78.2, heading directly to Nizhgbu Bay to carry out Operation Mike 6. Following an uneventful journey and a brief preliminary bombardment on January 31st, the 188th Glider Regiment successfully landed with minimal resistance and quickly advanced inland towards the Palacao River, aiming for the section of Route 17 that leads to Tagaytay Ridge. Pleased with the initial landing, Swing subsequently deployed the 187th Glider Regiment and the Divisional Artillery, which began to relieve rear elements of the 188th by midday. At the same time, the majority of the 188th secured the Palacao Bridge and crossed the river to reach Route 17. Further north, under pressure from MacArthur and Kruger, the 148th Regiment successfully crossed the Pampanga River and captured Calumpit, just as Butler was dispatching the 145th Regiment along Route 3 to assist in the advance towards Manila. At Clark Field, the 108th Regiment was patrolling forward, while the 160th Regiment faced challenges in breaking through enemy defenses. Meanwhile, the 129th Regiment launched an attack on the main positions of the Iguchi Detachment at top of the World Hill, successfully securing its deep, grassy southern and southeastern slopes. On Bataan, General Jones sent the 152nd Regiment to travel through Olongapo and to advance east along Route No. 7, while the 149th Regiment moved east towards Dinalupaham via the challenging terrain located about 1,200 yards north of the highway. By the end of January, the 32nd Division had successfully taken control of the recently vacated Tayogaria. The 6th and 25th Divisions reorganized in preparation for the final push towards San Jose, and the 1st Cavalry Division gathered at Gimba. Now, a little bit about the 1st Cavalry Division. The World War II brigade structure of Major General Vern Mudge's dismounted 1st Cavalry Division differed greatly from the triangular infantry division of the period. Instead of 3 infantry regiments of the 1st Cavalry Division, they had 4 cavalry regiments, the 5th and 12th in the 1st Cavalry Brigade, the 7th and 8th in the 2nd Cavalry Brigade. Each regiment had 2 cavalry squadrons, each smaller than an infantry battalion, as opposed to 3 battalions of infantry regiments. Each cavalry regiment contained weapons, troops armed with 81mm mortars, .30 caliber and .50 caliber machine guns, and bazookas, but there was no heavy weapons troop within each squadron. The cavalry regiments lacked the anti-tank and cannon companies of an infantry regiment. The 1st Cavalry Division artillery was composed of 1 75mm howitzer battalion, 3 105mm howitzer battalions, and, for obvious reasons, an attached 155mm howitzer battalion. Reinforcing combat and service attachments brought the divisional strength up to nearly 15,000 men, somewhat less than the strength of a reinforced 37th Division at the same time. On paper, each of the 4 cavalry regiments numbered about 1,750 men, in contrast to the 3,000 odd of an infantry regiment, but none of the 1st Cavalry Division's regiments was up to strength. The division had received few replacements since entering combat on Ledi in October, and it had come to Luzon with very little rest from its arduous campaign through the Ledi's mountains. The 1st Cavalry Division was ready to advance towards Cabanatuan, as General Mudge dispatched 2 reinforced motorized squadrons. On February the 1st, the flying columns led by General Chase crossed the Pampanga River and began their southern march with minimal resistance. As a result, Cabanatuan and Gapan were quickly captured, although some opposition was encountered south of the Penaranda River. Meanwhile, the 188th Glider Regiment continued its advance towards Takite Ridge, facing heavy enemy fire from Mount Carilao, but still managed to secure the important Mount Aiming. The 148th Regiment swiftly moved down Route 3 and captured Malolos with little resistance. However, the 152nd Regiment faced increasingly strong resistance at Zigzag Pass. While more rugged terrain than the Zigzag Pass area is to be found in Luzon, few pieces of ground combine to the same degree both in roughness and dense jungle. Route 7 twists violently through the pass, following a line of least resistance that wild pigs must originally have established. The jungle flora in the region is so thick that one can step 5 yards off the highway and not be able to see the road. The Japanese had honeycombed every hill and knoll at Zigzag, with foxholes linked by tunnels or trenches. At particularly advantageous points, they had constructed strong points centered around log and dirt pillboxes. All the defenses were well camouflaged, for rich jungle foliage covered most positions, indicating that many had been prepared with great care and had been constructed well before Colonel Nagayoshi's 39th Regiment had reached the area in December. Colonel Nagayoshi had plenty of food and ammunition for a prolonged stand, and he also possessed numerous mortars and machine guns. His artillery, however, was inadequate for the task at hand, and he lacked certain types of medical supplies, especially malaria preventatives and cures. He had so scattered his mortars and artillery in order to protect them against American artillery and air strikes that his troops would often have difficulty massing their fires. Finally, his defensive line was scarcely 2,000 yards wide northwest to southeast, thus rendering his whole position susceptible to vigorous outflanking maneuvers. On the other hand, he had good troops, well-prepared positions, and excellent defensive terrain. The 129th Regiment secured the summit of Top of the World Hill, effectively ensuring Clark Field's protection from all but long-range artillery fire. The 20th Regiment launched its initial attacks on Munoz, which was thwarted by Colonel Ida Kumpai's tanks fortified as pillboxes. Additionally, the 27th Regiment attempted to advance towards Umangan, but was unable to break through, while elements of the 35th Regiment bypassed this area and occupied Barrio San Roque. February the 2nd mirrored the previous day in San Jose sector, as the 20th and 27th Regiments continued their battle against the determined Japanese defenders. Meanwhile, Mullins dispatched the 35th Regiment in a two-pronged maneuver towards Umangan, successfully clearing most of the town by noon. In an effort to recover lost time, Mullins then directed the 35th towards Lupao in the afternoon, but its leading battalion was ultimately halted by intense Japanese artillery, motor, and machine gun fire. With his forward unit stalled at Minoz and at Lupao, Patrick and Mullins resorted to flanking tactics. Accordingly, Patrick sent the 1st Regiment along the Talavera River to attack San Jose from the southeast, while the 63rd Regiment attempted to bypass Minoz further to the east and rejoin Route 5 north of the town. In turn, Mullins ordered the 161st Regiment to move cross-country to positions on Route 99 south of Lupao, and then to advance to Route 8 between San Isidro and San Jose, while the 35th surrounded and cleared out Lupao. However, on this day, the 105th Division successfully evacuated San Jose along with its stockpiled ammunition, regrouping north of Puncan and rendering the entire San Jose offensive ineffective. Simultaneously, Chase's flying columns passed through Gapan and entered Sabang, fording the Angat River to launch 2 simultaneous advances south and east. The 148th Regiment secured Plaridel after a brief but fierce skirmish, while the 152nd Regiment faced setbacks in the Zigzag Pass due to the nighttime Japanese counterattacks and artillery fire. The 149th Regiment became disoriented and had to return to Olankapau, while the 1st Battalion of the 187th Glider Regiment moved forward to begin its assault towards Tagaytay. On February the 3rd, Swing's Glider Infantry launched an assault on the western end of Tagaytay, while paratroopers from the 511th Parachute Regiment began to drop along the ridge in a rather scattered manner. The first echelon of the 511th, about 915 men in all, had come to Tagaytay Ridge aboard 48 C-47 aircraft of the 317th Troop Carrier Group. The planes had flown north from Mindoro to approach Tagaytay Ridge from the northeast in order to avoid fire from Japanese anti-aircraft weapons west of the drop zone. The first 18 planes carrying about 345 troops dropped over the assigned area. At this juncture, planes from succeeding flights were nearly 6 miles and 3 minutes behind the lead aircraft. At about 8:20 a.m., one of these later planes dumped out a couple of bundles of supplies. Taking this as a signal that they were over the proper drop zone, troopers of the succeeding 30 planes began jumping. Aircraft pilots, realizing that they had not yet reached the proper point, attempted to halt the jumping, but the 511th jump masters continued sending the troops out. Most of them landed almost 5 miles east to northeast of the assigned drop zone. A second group of 51 C-47s began approaching the drop area at about 12:10, and some 80 men from the first 5 aircraft of this group landed in the proper place. The rest started out of their planes when they saw on the ground the collapsed chutes of the first misplaced jump. In the end, only 425 men landed on the actual assigned drop zone. The others, about 1,325 in all, made scattered landings 4.5 to 6 miles to the east and northeast. The 11th Airborne Division, blaming the 317th Troop Carrier Group for the premature droppings, reported that, quote, "True reason was the refusal of the Air Force to cooperate in the combined training program for airborne and Air Force troops." In any event, it appears that some lack of jump discipline within the 511th contributed to the scattered and premature jumping. Fortunately for them, they encountered minimal resistance as they secured the unoccupied ridge. To the north, the 148th Regiment continued its advance southwards, facing delays at several tidal streams that were unbridged and unfordable, but managed to reach a point about 2 miles south of Marilao by the day's end. At the same time, the 5th Cavalry's flying column destroyed a Japanese outpost at Angat and moved through the guerrilla-held Norzagare before crossing the Santa Maria River to join the 8th Cavalry's flying column, which had already progressed to Talipapa and was nearing the outskirts of Manila. Meanwhile, the 27th Regiment successfully eliminated the remaining enemy pockets at Umagan. The 3rd Battalion of the 35th Regiment, advancing over elevated terrain northeast of Lupao, established a position on Route 8 approximately 1,500 yards southeast of Lupao, while the rest of the regiment continued to launch unsuccessful frontal assaults upon the town. The 20th Regiment managed to overrun a few Japanese strongholds and Manoz, but was unable to break through. On February the 3rd, the 2nd Battalion of the 20th Infantry moved into the northwest, but could not reach Route 99 in its sector. The 3rd Battalion pushed across the road at the southwest corner of Manoz, but gained only half a block in the main section of the town. The 1st Battalion on the south side of Manoz made negligible progress. By dusk, the 20th Infantry had overrun a few Japanese strongpoints, but in order to hold its gains, it had to destroy completely and physically occupy every position it had reached so far. Manoz, as General Patrick had begun to realize, was going to be a costly, hard, and time-consuming nut to crack. The 20th Infantry had not yet closed in within the main Japanese defenses, but had spent most of the last 3 days pinned down by Japanese artillery, tanks, and machine gun fire. Only by hugging the ground and taking advantage of the little cover even shattered tree stumps could afford had the regiment kept its casualties down to about 50 men killed and 90 wounded. Meanwhile, the 63rd Regiment successfully bypassed Manaus and advanced up Route 5 towards Canawan, and the 1st Regiment similarly advanced along the San Jose-Rizal Road, assembling at 2 points 1,000 yards south and 1,500 yards east of San Jose. But that's going to be it for Luzon today, as we're now going to head into the Central Pacific. Following the successful capture of the Marianas and the establishment of B-29 Superfortress air bases on these islands, the Allies were finally able to conclude Operation Matterhorn and cease using bases in China and India for conducting raids on the Japanese mainland and other targets in East Asia. Between June the 5th of 1944 and January the 17th of 1945, General LeMay's 20th Bomber Command executed a total of 29 combat missions, inflicting significant damage on key military installations in southern Japan, Manchuria, Formosa, and Indochina, with a total loss of about 73 B-29s. Meanwhile, General Hansel's 21st Bomber Command, reinforced by the 313th Bombardment Wing, struggled to achieve similar outcomes in both daylight precision bombing and incendiary bombing, with the first 3 missions of January yielding the same disappointing results as those in December-November. To look into this issue further, on January the 3rd, Norstad's incendiary test mission was run on the 3rd of January, when 97 B-29s got off for Nagoya. Each plane carried a mixed load of bombs, about 14 350-pound M18 IB clusters fused to open at about 8,000 feet, and one 420-pound fragmentation cluster fused to open up at about 1,000 feet below releasing altitude. What with aborts and planes straying from course, only about 57 bombed the urban area designated as the primary target. Most of them releasing visually through cloud cover was rated about 610 at the time. Some of the fires were started, but there was no real holocaust, so to say. Smoke rising about 20,000 feet combined with cloud made the observation over the results impossible for the attackers. As a test, then, the mission was inconclusive. To the citizens of Nagoya, who were better informed than the intelligence officers of the 21st Bomber Command, the damage seemed slight. On January the 9th, having satisfied Nordstadt's requirements, the command returned to its program of precision bombing against aircraft factories. Performance, for the most part, was of a piece with what had gone before. Thus, on January the 9th of 1945, 72 B-29s were sent against Musashino, near Tokyo. High winds broke up the formations so that only 18 planes were able to bomb the target. 24 bombs, widely scattered in the plant area, destroyed one warehouse and damaged 2 others, a slight return for the effort expended, and about 6 B-29s were lost. On January the 14th, at the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works at Nagoya, precision bombing was again less than precise. 73 B-29s were airborne and about 40 bombed, hitting the No. 5 works area and damaging 3 buildings. Frustrated by this, Hansel increasingly blamed his crews for the unsatisfactory outcomes. Remarkably, he would only achieve his first fully successful B-29 attack on his final mission of the war. The target for the January 19th strike was Virgin. It was a plant of the Kawasaki Aircraft Industries Company located 2 miles northwest of Akashi, a village on the inland sea some 12 miles west of Kobe. The Akashi Works housed Kawasaki's general headquarters and one of the company's 2 largest production units, which built the twin-engine fighters, the Nick and the Randy, and the engines for the Tony, Oscar, and Frank fighters. Smaller than the Nakajima and the Mitsubishi, Kawasaki in 1944 delivered 17% of Japan's combat airframes and about 12% of its combat engines. Against Akashi, Hansel sent 77 B-29s plus 3 others in a diversionary strike. With good weather, 62 bolted through to the Kawasaki factory, damaging 155 tons of the GPS, and then returned with no losses. Interpreting strike photos, intelligence officers estimated that 38% of the roofed area showed major damage. This was an understatement. Every important building in both the engine and airframe branches had been hit, and production was cut by about 90%. Indeed, the Kawasaki company liquidated the combined plant and dispersed the machine tools, which had suffered only slightly, to other sites. The Akashi shops were given temporary repairs at the cost of 226 tons of critical materials and over 900 million yen, but the installation was used thereafter for only limited assembly jobs. It is a pity that the full results of this mission could not have been known to Hansel. His first completely successful B-29 attack, Akashi seemed to optimize the doctrines of precision bombardment he had championed, and it was his last strike of the war. Unaware of the success, Hansel was replaced the following day as the head of the 21st Bomber Command by one very determined General LeMay, who immediately suggested a shift to firebombing Japan's major cities. at low altitude during the nighttime, marking a stark departure from Hansel's previous strategies. However, the only obstacle in the flight path was Iwo Jima, which could alert the Japanese to an impending raid and still had operational airfields capable of launching interception fighters. These airfields had also been used for sporadic air assaults against the Marianas, although a few attacks were actually carried out in January. Capturing Iwo Jima would resolve the issues, and Admiral Nimitz aimed to establish emergency landing facilities for B-29s based out of Saipan, as well as a base for fighter escorts targeting Japan. Consequently, he decided to proceed with the invasion, codenamed Operation Detachment. After this operation, Nimitz planned to invade Okinawa to secure and develop a robust air and naval base for the assault upon the Japanese home islands, which we will discuss further on. For the Iwo Jima operation, Admiral Spruance was once again given overall command of what was being called the Big Blue Fleet, which was redesignated as the Fifth Fleet. Under his command, Vice Admiral Regiment Turner led Task Force 51, the Joint Expeditionary Force responsible for landing Lieutenant General Holland Smith's expeditionary troops. Turner was supported by Rear Admiral William Blandy's Task Force 52, the Amphibious Support Force, which included 10 escort carriers, Rear Admiral Harry Hill's Task Force 53, comprising all transports and landing craft, Rear Admiral Bertram Rogers' Task Force 54, which had 6 battleships and 5 cruisers for short bombardment, and Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher's Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Force. For the amphibious invasion, Major General Harry Schmidt's 5th Amphibious Corps would deploy the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, planning to land the 4th and 5th Divisions side by side with 2 regiments east along the 2-mile stretch of beach between Mount Suribachi and the East Boat Basin on the island's southeast corner. Smith and Schmidt also decided to limit corps artillery to 2 battalions of 155mm howitzers, organized as the 1st Provisional Field Artillery Group due to the limited space available for emplacements on the island. After landing, Major General Clifton Cates' 4th Marine Division would take control of the Motoyama Plateau and its airfields, while also capturing the 01 line of the Corps' right flank. Meanwhile, Major General Keller Rocky's 5th Marine Division would secure the Mount Suribachi region before advancing northeast to capture the 01 line on the Corps' left flank. They would then push across the island until Iwo Jima was fully secured. At the same time, Major General Graves Erskine's 3rd Marine Division would remain in the reserve, with only its 21st Marine Regiment deployed as the Corps Reserve. To aid in this effort, the 7th Air Force under Generals Harmon and Hale had been consistently targeting Iwo Jima's facilities since about August of 1944. Following intense attacks in December, which included bombardments by Rear Admiral Alan Smith's 5th Cruiser Division against Iwo Jima, Hahajima, and Chichijima, were again struck on January the 5th, but the next bombardment wouldn't occur until January the 25th. A fighter sweep by 28 P-38s opened up the attack at 9:45, 62 B-29s bombed at about 11 o'clock, and 102 B-24s at noon. Cruiser Division 5 under Rear Admiral Alan E. Smith, comprising heavy cruisers Chester, Pensacola, and Salt Lake City, with 6 destroyers, arrived off Iwo Jima at about 1:30, and they opened bombardment at 1:47. Oak Smith approached the island from the west, rounded Mount Suribachi, and then reversed track in a half circle. Unfortunately, the sky was so heavily overcast as to force the planes to bomb by radar and to hamper the ship's spotting. Surface visibility was good enough to enable the island to be well covered by naval bombardment, which lasted for 70 minutes and expended about 1,500 rounds of 8-inch, 5,334 rounds of 5-inch shells. The bombers dropped 814 tons of bombs. Photographs taken 3 days later showed that both the airfields on Iwo Jima were wholly or in part operational, but no more enemy air raids hit the Marianas until Christmas Day. The job of keeping Iwo Jima's airfields neutralized was now turned over to B-24s of the 7th Air Force. Between December the 8th of 1944 and February the 15th of 1945, they flew at least 1 strike daily over the island. The day after Christmas, Rear Admiral Smith's heavy cruisers, together with 5 destroyers, delivered a second bombardment, coordinated with a B-24 strike. The strike was slightly more eventful than the initial one in December, but even less effective. The bombardment, which expended 1,500 rounds of 8-inch, provoked the return fire of 6-inch coastal defense batteries, designated Kitty on the target maps, in the northeast part of the island, but Kitty's claws managed to strike no closer than 200 yards. As proof of the slight damage inflicted by this bombardment, the Japanese were able to pay a vicious return visit to Saipan on Christmas Eve, a raid of 25 planes which destroyed 1 B-29 and damaged 3 others, beyond repair. Cruiser Division 5 returned on December the 27th for a repeat performance, lighter than the others, and only a fourth of the bombardment was set up for January the 5th of 1945. While fighter planes and B-24s hit Iwo Jima, the same cruisers and 6 destroyers bombarded Chichijima, 145 northwards, and about slightly nearer to Hawajima. Their hope was to catch a convoy bringing Japanese supplies to these islands, whence they were forwarded to Iwo Jima by smaller craft at night. The destroyer Fanning steamed ahead of the group as a radar picket, encountering at about 2:06 a.m. a surface target, later identified as LCV-102, which she sank. At 7 a.m., Admiral Smith's group opened up 1 hour and 49 minutes bombardment upon Chichijima. During it, destroyer David Taylor suffered an underwater explosion, probably from a mine, which flooded her forward magazine. The Iwo Jima bombardment by Salt Lake City and the 2 destroyers lasted for just about an hour. Cruiser Division 5 then pounded Iwo Jima for another hour and 3/4. The reply was negligible, and a few aircraft which made passes as the cruisers were easily driven off. Starting on the last day of January and continuing for 2 weeks, the 7th Air Force aircraft bombed the island day and night, occasionally joined by LeMay's superfortresses. For 10 weeks, Iwo Jima faced nearly daily bombardments from land-based aircraft, with nearly 6,800 tons of bombs being dropped. Additionally, there were 5 naval bombardments that fired about 203 rounds of 16-inch shells, 7,000 rounds of 8-inch shells, and more than 15,000 rounds of 5-inch shells. Under normal circumstances, such a heavy and sustained bombardment would have been more than enough to devastate an island of that size. However, the Japanese managed to restore the airfields on Iwo Jima just hours after each attack, and they continued to strengthen their defenses on the island. Following the fall of Saipan, the Japanese appointed Lieutenant General Kurabayashi Tadamichi to oversee the defenses of the Bonin Islands, renaming the Agasawara District Group as the 109th Division. Kurabayashi stationed Major General Tochibana Yoshio's 1st Mixed Brigade and most of Colonel Aida Yusuke's 17th Independent Mixed Regiment on Chichijima, along with several other units across the islands. He accurately predicted that Iwo Jima would be the target for the Allied landing, and he took measures to make it virtually indestructible. To this end, he coordinated with Major General Sendai Saduse's 6th Mixed Brigade, Colonel Ikeda Maso's 145th Regiment, and Lieutenant Colonel Baron Nishi Takeishi's severely weakened 26th Tank Regiment, which had sustained heavy losses from the American submarine attacks at sea. Additionally, Major Fujiwara Tadamichi's 3rd Battalion of the 17th Independent Mixed Regiment, and a robust artillery unit led by Colonel Keido Chosaku, which included the defense of Rear Admiral Ichimura Toshinosuke, also provided significant naval garrison on the island, centered around the 27th Air Flotilla, bringing Kurabayashi's total forces to approximately 21,060 men, far exceeding the American estimate of 13,000. Aware that the beaches would be vulnerable to enemy naval and air assaults, Kurabayashi opted to strengthen Mount Sotobachi and the Motoyama Plateau areas. Mount Sotobachi was made a semi-independent defensive sector, its heavily fortified positions bristling with weapons of all types, ranging from casemated coastal defense guns and artillery to automatic weapons and placed in mutually supporting pillboxes. The narrow isthmus connecting Sotobachi to the rest of the island was lightly held by infantry, but heavily defended by enfilade fire from artillery, rockets, and mortars, and placed on both the high ground in the south, Sotobachi's area, and the northern portion of the island. The main defense line was a belt of mutually supporting positions organized in depth, running generally northwest-southeast across the island. It stretched from the cliffs north of the western beaches south to include Airfield No. 2, then turning eastwards through Minami, terminated at a rugged coastal north and east of the beaches. Pillboxes, blockhouses, bunkers, and dug-in tanks strengthened the defenses in a naturally formidable terrain everywhere throughout this belt. The second defensive line generally bisected the remaining area of the northern portion of the island. It began several hundred yards below Kitano Point at the northwest coast, cut through Airfield No. 3, and then through the Motoyama area in the center, and then terminated between Tachiwa Point and the East Boat Basin on the eastern coast. Man-made emplacements were not as numerous in the second line, but natural caves and other covered positions afforded by fantastically rugged terrain were skillfully organized for the defense. The beaches would be lightly defended, but would receive fire support from elevated positions. A substantial reserve force, including tanks, was also prepared to counterattack and push the Americans back into the sea if they managed to establish a foothold. In a shift from traditional Japanese defensive strategies, Kurabayashi moved away from a full-scale counterattack and suicide banzai charges, instead instructing his troops to hold their mutually supported positions to the very last, to carry out small unit counterattacks at cutoff points. It goes without saying, Kurabayashi is going to prove himself to be one of the most formidable Japanese commanders of this war. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, a newly titled podcast on all major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, I actually recently just released an episode with my co-host Garav, covering who we think were the best and worst generals of the Pacific War. And as many of you probably know, although I do love Yamashita, I have to admit, Kurabayashi is definitely on the same level as him, if not better. So if you want to hear a bit more about this general before we jump into the Battle of Iwo Jima, please go check it out. If you want to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. I recently put out a community post on my Patreon and my YouTube membership, asking if my exclusive members would be interested in a little passion project. I'm thinking of doing a multi-part series covering an alternate history of basically what if Japan did better during World War II. I'm not going to call it what if Japan won World War II, but it's along those lines. I have to admit, this one would take an incredible amount of research, but I think it could be a lot of fun. But stating that if this is of interest to you, please come join the Patreon or YouTube membership to check it out. The Allied forces continued their advance through Luzon, battling Japanese defenses, liberating prisoners, and securing key locations, paving the way for a final push towards Manila. Meanwhile, in Iwo Jima, General Kurabayashi was preparing for a final stand, hoping beyond hope to make the Americans pay so dearly they might end the war.